There are stories from war that defy the neat boundaries of good and evil. Stories that don't just challenge our sense of right and wrong. They complicate it. They remind us that in the darkest corners of human cruelty, there can sometimes shine a small, stubborn light. This is the story of John Rabe, a man wearing the Nazi swastika, who became a guardian angel to hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians. But to understand the full weight of what he did in Nanjing, we have to begin long before the Japanese army reached the city walls. We have to understand who this man was, what brought him to China, and how his life collided with one of the most horrific massacres of the 20th century. John Rabe was born in Hamburg in 1882, a typical product of the German middle class. He was raised with a blend of Lutheran ethics and German nationalism, deeply shaped by the old imperial German spirit that mixed industry, order, and a kind of quiet pride. There was nothing about his early life that hinted at heroism. He was an electrical engineer by training, a man who, like many in his generation, found his path not through war or politics, but through work, through building things, through the steady logic of machines. In 1908, he accepted a position with Siemens in Halsk and was posted to China. It was, for him, an adventure. At the time, China was a nation staggering under the weight of imperial humiliation, internal strife, and foreign occupation. But for Rabe, offered opportunity. He quickly rose through the company, becoming Siemens' representative in Beijing, then Tianjin, and finally Nanjing, China's capital by the 1930s. For nearly 30 years, Rabe lived in China. He loved it, not in the superficial way some foreigners romanticize the East, but in the daily, lived-in way that comes with decades of connection. He spoke fluent Mandarin. His wife, Dora, often accompanied him. He had a Chinese cooking staff, and he socialized not just with Europeans, but with Chinese colleagues. He wasn't an activist. He wasn't political. He was, in many ways, a quiet colonial figure, an outsider profiting from China's turmoil, but not seeking to exploit it maliciously. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1931, back when it was still rising in Germany, but his reasons were more practical than ideological. He believed it might help him keep his job with Siemens, which increasingly depended on favor from the German government. In his own words, he supported Hitler's economic reforms, but not his racial ideology. He was, like many Germans abroad at the time, apolitical in dangerous ways. Then came 1937. The Second Sino-Japanese War was exploding into full fury. Japan had already seized Manchuria and now turned its eyes southward. In August, Japanese forces attacked Shanghai, launching a brutal campaign that eventually pushed Chinese forces back toward the capital, Nanjing. As the Chinese Nationalist Army fled, chaos followed. Looting, panic, mass evacuations. And with the collapse of order came the grim knowledge. The Japanese army was closing in, and its reputation was already soaked in blood. The stories coming from Shanghai weren't just a military victory. They were of rape, execution, torture. Something monstrous was coming. By November, foreign diplomats and business people began fleeing the city. John Rabe could have joined them. He had the connections. He had the resources. But he didn't leave. And this is where the story begins to change. This is the point where a man like Rabe, middle-aged, comfortable, affiliated with a government already infamous for its own brand of tyranny, could have just walked away. And yet he didn't. Instead, he stayed. Not just out of loyalty to Siemens, but because he believed he could help. He believed that as a German, and more importantly, as a member of the Nazi Party, an ally of Japan, he might be able to negotiate a kind of protection for the civilians left behind. And so, along with a small group of other foreigners, mostly missionaries, doctors, and businessmen, Rabe helped form what would become the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. The idea was simple. Carve out a part of the city that would be declared off-limits to Japanese forces. Within this zone, refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, could find shelter. The hope was that the presence of Westerners and the association with neutral or Axis nations might stay the Japanese soldiers' hands. It was a fragile hope, and as we will soon see, it was one constantly under threat. But it was all they had. Rabe became chairman of the committee, partly because of his party affiliation, partly because of his determination. He turned his own home, a large property with a garden and multiple buildings, into a safe haven. Thousands would eventually seek shelter there. He hoisted the Nazi flag over his compound, not as a symbol of oppression, but as a desperate shield. The irony of it was staggering. The symbol of hate used as a plea for mercy. What followed over the next weeks would defy belief. The Japanese army entered Nanjing on December 13, 1937, and almost immediately, the nightmare began. Soldiers went door to door, dragging civilians into the streets. Women, some as young as 8, others in their 70s, were raped, mutilated, murdered. Men suspected of being soldiers or simply of resisting were summarily executed, often in mass shootings along the banks of the Yangtze River. The death toll spiraled. Conservative estimates place it at 200,000. Some believe it was far higher. Amid this horror, John Rabe stood firm. He wrote daily letters to the Japanese embassy. He confronted military officers. He physically stepped between soldiers and civilians. In one documented case, he faced down a group of soldiers trying to abduct 2 Chinese girls, waving his armband and shouting in German until they relented. His diaries from this time, later published, are harrowing. They speak of nights filled with screams, of bodies piling in the streets, of the unbearable stench of death. But they also speak of quiet victories, of children saved, of women protected, of families who lived because one man and a small group of others refused to look away. And this is where we pause, not because the story ends here, but because to understand what Rabe did next, we must dive even deeper into the logistics of the safety zone, into the psychological toll it took on him, and into the ways he tried to alert the world to what he had seen, only to be silenced by the very nation he represented. The Nanjing safety zone was only about 4 square kilometers, a small pocket of the city surrounded by death. Within its makeshift borders were schools, churches, foreign embassies, and university grounds, each turned into emergency shelters for tens of thousands of terrified people. It wasn't officially recognized by any military authority, and yet it was all that stood between life and annihilation for civilians who managed to make it inside. It existed not by treaty or decree, but by the sheer willpower of the few foreigners who refused to flee. At the center of that fragile miracle stood John Rabe. By the time the Japanese army entered the city in December 1937, around 22 foreigners had chosen to stay behind. Among them were George Fitch, an American missionary, Minnie Vautrin, an American teacher at Jinling College, Dr. Robert Wilson, the only surgeon left in Nanjing, and several others from Germany, Denmark, and China itself. None of them were soldiers. They were teachers, doctors, pastors, and businessmen. Yet they took on the unimaginable task of protecting over 200,000 desperate souls. John Rabe, with his calm German authority and that infamous swastika armband, became the reluctant leader of this group. His presence carried weight with the Japanese officers, who respected Germany's alliance with Japan. That fragile respect often became the only thing that prevented a massacre inside the zone. Rabe knew this and used it relentlessly. He wrote letters, filed protests, and kept meticulous records of every assault, every murder, every outrage that occurred outside their gates. He did not write as a politician or a diplomat. He wrote as a man watching humanity collapse before his eyes. Night after night, the streets around the safety zone were filled with screams. Japanese soldiers, often drunk, went on killing sprees, executing men in the streets, dragging women from homes, torching buildings. The smell of smoke, gunpowder, and blood became the air the city breathed. And yet inside the zone, the people clung to a fragile sense of safety. It wasn't peace, but it was survival. Rabe's own home, on Guanghua Road, became a sanctuary for more than 600 people at one point. He used the seamen's warehouse next door to store rice, blankets, and medicine. His garden was full of makeshift tents and cooking fires. He walked among them daily, checking on the sick, comforting children, organizing supplies, and writing in his diary each night under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Those diary pages, smuggled out of China years later, would become one of the most haunting personal testaments of the Nanjing Massacre. He wrote, "I cannot bear to look at the suffering around me. The dead lie in heaps, the stench unbearable. Yet every day, hundreds more come to the gate begging for entry. I cannot turn them away. I have no right to. But the walls are full, and I do not know how much longer we can hold. Inside the zone, order depended entirely on the foreigners' diplomacy and courage. They patrolled the perimeter, arguing with Japanese soldiers, brandishing their flags and credentials. Rabe's swastika, for all its later symbolism of evil, was his only weapon. When soldiers attempted to storm a refugee camp, he would step forward, shouting in German, sometimes bluffing that he had reported their actions directly to the German embassy or even to Berlin. The soldiers, wary of offending an Axis ally, often backed down. Rabe's armband became a shield not just for himself, but for thousands who were behind his name. But that shield was not invincible. There were nights when soldiers ignored the warnings, when Japanese trucks pulled up outside the gates and demanded entry, when women were dragged away despite desperate protests. There were times when Rabe's letters went unanswered, when his pleas fell into silence. Still, he refused to stop writing. Each complaint, each diary entry, each photograph was evidence he hoped would someday be used to bring justice. He also began filming. Using a small Siemens camera, Rabe documented what he could: bombed buildings, wounded civilians, and endless lines of refugees. His films and photographs would later serve as crucial visual proof of the massacre. In his mind, this was not just a humanitarian act. It was a moral record, a record against forgetting. What made Rabe's work extraordinary wasn't just his courage, but his ability to see humanity where others saw only enemies. He had every reason to leave. His company ordered him to evacuate. His government did not support his mission. His own country's ideology was one of racial superiority, yet here he was, risking his life for people his government considered inferior. The contradiction was staggering, but it also revealed something deeply human about him. That morality can survive even inside monstrous systems, that conscience can bloom in poisoned soil. Within the zone, the people began calling him the living Buddha of Nanjing. It was an honorific born not out of politics, but gratitude. He was a tall, stern man, often seen walking the streets in his suit and hat, handing out rice or comforting crying children. To many, he seemed almost supernatural, a figure who could hold back death simply by standing in its path. But as the weeks dragged on, the strain took its toll. Rabe began losing weight, sleeping less, and suffering headaches from stress. The small committee met daily, sometimes debating for hours about how to distribute food or where to hide new arrivals. The hospitals overflowed. Dr. Wilson performed surgeries for days without rest, while Minnie Vautrin worked herself to exhaustion protecting women at the college. Every one of them risked execution if caught hiding soldiers or criticizing Japanese actions. And yet they stayed. As January 1938 arrived, Nanjing was a ghost city. Its streets littered with corpses, its air thick with the ashes of burned homes. But the safety zone still stood, a tiny island of humanity, surrounded by unimaginable cruelty. Rabe continued to send letters, pleas to the Japanese embassy, to the German ambassador in Tokyo, even to Hitler himself. He begged them to intervene, to stop the bloodshed. His letters were polite, formal, even deferential, but between the lines burned desperation. He received no reply from Berlin. None ever came. Still, he did not stop writing. His faith in bureaucracy was perhaps naive, but it gave him something to cling to, an illusion that his reports might matter, that the world might care. In truth, the world would not learn the full horror of Nanjing for years. As January turned to February, the Japanese army began to restore some order in the city. The worst of the killing eased, but the suffering lingered. Disease spread, food ran short, and survivors began to crawl out from ruins, dazed and hollow-eyed. By March, the Japanese authorities began pressuring the foreigners to leave. The safety zone, they declared, was no longer necessary. Rabe knew that once he left, the fragile protection would vanish. But he also knew he could not stay forever. He had to carry his testimony back to Germany. He had to make people listen. When John Rabe finally boarded the ship to return home in February 1938, Nanjing's refugees gathered to see him off. They brought gifts, handwritten letters, pieces of silk, small tokens of gratitude. Many wept openly. He promised them he would tell the world what had happened. When John Rabe returned to Germany in the spring of 1938, he did not come back as a hero. There was no parade, no welcoming committee, no recognition of the humanitarian feat he had accomplished in Nanjing. What he carried with him wasn't a tale of military conquest or commercial success, but horrifying truth, a record of genocide committed by an ally of the Nazi regime. And he intended to tell the world. He arrived in Berlin with more than just personal belongings. In his suitcase were reels of film, stacks of letters, reports, and the battered pages of his diary. On those pages were the names of women he'd saved, children he'd comforted, atrocities he'd witnessed. He was exhausted but resolute. In his mind, he had a duty to speak, not just to honor the dead, but to try and stop the same fate from befalling others. He believed, perhaps naively, that if the German government saw what Japan had done, it might step in. That maybe Hitler himself would be outraged by the actions of his allies. That someone, somewhere in power, would listen. He was wrong. In late 1938, shortly after his return, Rabe organized a lecture in Berlin, inviting business leaders, academics, and Nazi officials to hear about what happened in Nanjing. He showed films. He passed around photographs. He spoke, not as a critic, but as a loyal German, a party member, a man trying to protect German honor by condemning something too monstrous to ignore. He made it clear these atrocities have been committed by Japanese troops, not Germans. And in his mind, speaking out was not disloyal, it was righteous. But the reaction was swift and cold. Within days of the lecture, the Gestapo came to his door. He was interrogated, his diaries and documents confiscated. He was accused of undermining German-Japanese relations. The Nazi Party, already in a strategic alliance with Japan, had no interest in hearing about Japanese war crimes. Truth was inconvenient. And in a regime built on propaganda and racial superiority, Rabe's sympathy for the Chinese, his insistence on their humanity, was seen as subversive. He was banned from speaking publicly about Nanjing. Siemens placed him on indefinite leave. And just like that, the man who had risked his life to protect over 200,000 civilians found himself silenced, unemployed, and under suspicion. For years, Rabe lived in relative obscurity. He was not in prison, but he was closely watched. He continued to write, quietly, privately, but his reports were never published during the war. His health began to decline. His money ran out. His home in Berlin was bombed in the final years of the war, and by 1945, he was living in near poverty, surviving on food aid and what little Siemens could provide. And yet, through it all, he kept the memory of Nanjing alive. In the years that followed, as the world confronted the full horrors of World War II, Rabe's story was largely forgotten. The Nanjing Massacre, too, was little known in the West, overshadowed by the Holocaust, by Hiroshima, by the vast scale of the European front. The crimes in China received limited attention. Japan, for its part, denied or minimized its role. Trials were held, yes, but many of the key perpetrators escaped justice. And Rabe, with his fragile health and dwindling resources, was left watching the world move on. But not everyone forgot. In 1945, after the war ended, a letter arrived in Rabe's Berlin apartment. It was from China, from the people of Nanjing, and in it were not just words of thanks, but a plea. They had not forgotten what he had done. They had not forgotten the man who stood between them and the abyss, and they wanted to help. Within weeks, care packages began to arrive. Food, clothing, medicine, letters of gratitude, sometimes written in broken German or careful Chinese characters. It wasn't much, but for Rabe, it was everything. It was proof that what he had done mattered, that his voice, silenced at home, still echoed across continents. The people he had protected were now trying to save him. And yet, there was a quiet tragedy in these final years. Rabe's health worsened. He suffered from chronic headaches, memory loss, and eventually a stroke. The man who had once stood firm before armed soldiers, who had argued with generals and saved families with shout and a flag, now struggled to walk. His body failed him, but his mind, when clear, remained focused on the past. He spoke often of the children in the zone, of the garden filled with makeshift tents, of the women who clung to his arm, begging for protection. He remembered everything. And every time someone would ask him why he had done it, why he, of all people, a businessman, a Nazi, a foreigner, had risked his life for strangers, he always gave the same answer: because I saw what was happening, and I could not look away. John Rabe died in 1950, largely unknown outside China. He was buried in a modest grave in Berlin. No statues were built, no honors were given, but half a world away, in the city he once saved, a different story was unfolding. Long after the gunfire stopped and the ashes settled, the city of Nanjing did not forget. The memories of December 1937 had carved themselves too deeply into its soul. For the survivors, many of them children at the time, the safety zone was more than just a place of shelter. It was where they had learned to believe, even briefly, that not all the world was cruel, that amid horror, a stranger could become family, that behind the cold insignia of a foreign power, there could still beat a heart. For decades, John Rabe's name was spoken quietly among the older generation, not in textbooks, not in official histories, but in living rooms, in personal stories passed down like heirlooms. Mothers told their daughters, fathers told their sons. There was a foreigner who stayed, a man who wore the armband of the enemy, but who gave us life. And while much of the world had already pushed the massacre into the footnotes of history, the people of Nanjing carried Rabe with them. In the late 1980s, as China began opening up to the world again, researchers and historians started uncovering previously sealed records. Among them was Rabe's long-lost diary, hidden for decades, passed down through his family, until it resurfaced in Germany and was eventually published. It wasn't just a historical document. It was a testimony, a confession, a daily chronicle of one man's helplessness in the face of atrocity and his desperate, often futile, attempts to fight back against it. The diary's publication in 1998 shocked the world. The voice that emerged from its pages wasn't that of a hardened ideologue or a self-congratulatory savior. It was vulnerable, frustrated, human. Rabe wrote about the sounds of babies crying through the night, about women clinging to his sleeves, begging him to intervene, about the weight of trying to be a wall when the tide kept rising. It was history written not by a general or a politician, but by a man who simply couldn't bear to walk away. And with its publication, something extraordinary began to happen. In Nanjing, the silence broke. Survivors, many of them now elderly, came forward to tell their stories. They remembered the long nights in Rabe's compound, the food handed out in careful portions, the calm voice in a foreign tongue that made them feel, if not safe, at least not forgotten. Some recalled Rabe personally lifting children over the gates into the safety zone. Others remembered how he paced at night, refusing to sleep, always watching. They spoke not just of his actions, but of the aura he carried, the strange, paradoxical comfort of being shielded by a man from a regime whose own crimes would soon shock the world. The city of Nanjing made a decision. It would not let this man be forgotten. In 1996, a memorial plaque was placed at the site of John Rabe's former residence on Guanghua Road. The house, one abandoned and overgrown, was cleaned, restored, and eventually transformed into John Rabe and International Safety Zone Memorial Hall, a living museum dedicated not only to Rabe, but to all who had risked their lives during the massacre to protect civilians. His office, his bedroom, the garden where refugees once slept under stars, all of it preserved, not as a shrine to perfection, but as a reminder of imperfect courage. Visitors began coming, first locals and Chinese tourists, and eventually international guests. They walked through the rooms and read the diary excerpts on the walls. They saw the faded photographs, the typed reports, the grainy footage Rabe had captured on his Siemens camera. They stood in silence before the Nazi flag he had used as a shield, not as a symbol of ideology, but as a twisted relic of moral irony. And for many, something changed. The name John Rabe became a prism, through which the nature of courage could be examined, not as a domain of saints, but as a choice made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. He had not been perfect. He had not been a rebel or a martyr, or even, in the strictest sense, a dissenter. He had simply stayed when others left. He had spoken when others were silent. And in doing so, he had offered a glimpse into what moral resistance can look like. Not loud, not dramatic, but stubborn, steady, unyielding. Chinese schools began teaching his story. Documentaries were made. In 2009, a German-Chinese co-production film titled John Rabe was released, dramatizing his life and bringing his story to new audiences. It showed the world what had been hidden for too long, that even inside the machinery of oppressive systems, humanity can still flicker, that someone can wear the uniform of tyranny and still act with compassion. And in China, where scars from the war remain raw even today, Rabe became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol of cross-cultural respect, of shared pain, and of unexpected grace. On anniversaries of the massacre, flowers are still laid at his memorial. His face, once obscured by politics, now stands in bronze. His name is etched into the city he once refused to abandon. But even now, his story is not simple. It invites discomfort. It forces reflection. How do we reconcile the Nazi armband with a man who saved lives? How do we honor courage without ignoring complicity? These are questions without easy answers. But perhaps that is the point. Rabe's legacy doesn't offer moral clarity. It offers a mirror. And in that mirror, we see a truth far more complicated and far more important than simple heroism. History, like memory, is often shaped not just by facts, but by who controls the narrative. In the years after John Rabe's death, his story existed in fragments, shuffled between nations, mistranslated, ignored, or twisted to suit different political climates. And while Nanjing quietly remembered him, the wider world was slower to embrace his legacy, not because what he did was unimportant, but because it didn't fit neatly into the narratives the world wanted to tell after World War II. By the time the war ended, the focus of global memory shifted westward. The Holocaust, Hiroshima, the Nuremberg trials, the rise and fall of Hitler. These were the epicenters of post-war reckoning. The atrocities in Asia, though vast in scale, struggled for attention. Japan, now a Cold War ally of the United States, had every incentive to downplay its wartime crimes. The West, focused on rebuilding Europe and containing communism, turned its gaze elsewhere. And in that geopolitical shuffle, the rape of Nanjing became a buried wound. John Rabe's story, too, fell into obscurity, an inconvenient footnote that challenged the binary of villain and hero. He was, after all, a Nazi. How could a man wearing that armband possibly be remembered as a savior? In the simplified morality of post-war media, there was little space for contradictions. People wanted clear lines, black and white. Not a German businessman protecting Chinese civilians from Japanese war crimes, all while pledging loyalty to a regime committing its own genocide thousands of miles away. But as time passed, historians began to re-examine these contradictions. They saw in Rabe's story a vital truth, that morality doesn't always wear the uniform we expect, that sometimes people act not because of their politics, but in spite of them, and that inside even the darkest systems, there are those who choose to disobey not with rebellion, but with humanity. Still, the conversation around Rabe was not without controversy. Some scholars warned against romanticizing him. They pointed out that he never formally renounced Nazism, that his support for Hitler's early economic policies, even after witnessing the horrors in China, showed a dangerous level of moral compartmentalization. Others argued that his actions in Nanjing should not be excused simply because they were exceptional, that placing too much focus on a single good Nazi risked minimizing the broader machinery of fascist brutality. But even in these debates, there was agreement on one point. What Rabe did in Nanjing was real, documented, courageous, and worthy of remembrance. In China, his memory became a symbol not just of gratitude, but of justice denied. The massacre he tried to stop had left deep, unhealed scars. Many of the Japanese officers responsible were never punished. Some went on to hold prominent positions in post-war Japan. Official apologies were rare. And for survivors, the pain of silence, of seeing their suffering ignored, only deepened over time. Rabe's story became a rallying point, not because it absolved Japan, but because it offered proof that what happened in Nanjing was not an exaggeration, that even a foreigner from a nation aligned with Japan had seen it, had documented it, had been horrified by it. His diary, his letters, his grainy photographs. These became weapons in the fight against historical denial. But even as China embraced Rabe, his story was sometimes used for political ends. During periods of tension with Japan, state media would highlight his heroism as a counterpoint to Japanese revisionism. School textbooks would teach students about the massacre through the lens of Rabe's courage. Documentaries and dramas would evoke his name to stir national pride. And while much of this was sincere, some of it veered into myth-making, turning Rabe into something larger, cleaner, more heroic than he ever claimed to be. Yet, perhaps that's inevitable. In a world desperate for symbols, we often sculpt the messy into the memorable. We carve stories down to their most inspiring edges. But John Rabe resisted that. In his own writing, he never portrayed himself as a hero. He wrote about his fear, his helplessness, his failure to stop much of what he saw. He admitted his frustrations, his nightmares, his doubts. He never pretended to be a saint. Only a man trying to do what was right when everything around him was wrong. And that is why his legacy matters. Not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. Because he is proof that even those shaped by troubling ideologies can still choose compassion. That moral action is not reserved for the righteous, but for the willing. In the decades since his story resurfaced, other narratives have emerged alongside his. Chinese doctors, American missionaries, Danish pastors, Chinese civilians who risked their lives to smuggle people into the zone. Together, they form a tapestry of resistance, a reminder that while evil often moves in armies, goodness moves in individuals. And in Germany, too, Rabe's story has slowly gained recognition. Streets bear his name. Schools teach his history. In 2009, German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited China and acknowledged Rabe's humanitarian efforts. The irony was not lost on anyone. A representative of a nation that once tried to silence him, now honoring his memory on Chinese soil. Still, even today, his story remains largely unknown in much of the Western world. His name is not taught alongside Oskar Schindler or Raoul Wallenberg. His face is not carved into memorials in Washington or London. And perhaps that's the final truth of his life. That moral courage, when it doesn't align with national myth or political convenience, is often left in the shadows. But those shadows don't last forever. They were children. Most of them didn't understand the full horror that was unfolding outside the walls of the safety zone. But they remember the screams, the gunshots, the sound of boots echoing through empty alleys, the sharp smell of smoke, blood, and fear that seemed to linger in the air day and night. And they remember him, the tall man with the kind eyes, the one who didn't speak their language perfectly but whose presence somehow made them feel safe. For many survivors of the Nanjing Massacre, memories of John Rabe are not historical abstractions. They are vivid, emotional fragments of youth spent in hiding, in hunger, and in terror. These were the people whose lives intersected with Rabe not in official meetings or reports, but in rice lines, makeshift clinics, and crowded courtyards filled with frightened families. To them, Rabe was not a diplomat or a party member. He was simply the man who stayed when others ran. One survivor, Zhang Xiaoying, was just a teenager in 1937. Her family had lost everything in the bombing. Her father had been taken away by soldiers. Her mother brought her and her younger brother to the compound on Guanghua Road. Years later, Zhang would recall how Rabe personally helped her mother carry her brother, too weak to walk. She remembered Rabe giving out rice from a tin container, smiling gently even as he looked bone-tired. He was not like the others, she said in an interview decades later. He didn't treat us like we were beneath him. He looked at us, really looked. I remember thinking, if there are gods, he is one of them. Another woman, Wu Jin, recalled nights huddled with hundreds of others in the hall of a university building under Rabe's jurisdiction. The windows were boarded, the lights dim. Outside, they could hear the screams of women and the laughter of drunk soldiers. She remembered the way Rabe would walk the halls at night, flashlight in hand, checking that the guards were awake, that the children were quiet, that the doors were locked. He was always moving, she said, like he could never rest. Like if he stopped walking, the horror would catch up to him too. The survivors often spoke of the small things: how Rabe gave up his own food rations for sick children, how he bandaged wounds with his own shirts when supplies ran out, how he stood at the gate each morning, greeting new arrivals with a nod, inspecting them for injuries, separating the wounded from the dying, and always writing in that diary of his, capturing everything as if he knew the world might someday doubt their suffering. For many of these survivors, Rabe's presence gave them a sense of dignity in a time when humanity was being stripped from them piece by piece. The Japanese soldiers dehumanized the Chinese population. They treated them as insects, as disposable. But Rabe refused to. He saw faces, names, stories. Chun Fong, who was just 6 years old at the time, remembered little except for a tall man who let him sit on his lap during meal distributions. He smelled like soap and sweat, Chin recalled, but his arms were warm. I didn't know who he was until years later. All I knew then was that I felt safe when he held me. These testimonies came not just from memory, but from a deep need to make sure the world didn't forget. As they aged, the survivors wrote letters, participated in interviews, and worked with historians to document their experiences. For many, speaking about Rabe was their way of honoring not just the man himself, but all those who had been forgotten, those whose lives ended in the darkness outside the safety zone, whose names were never written down. And while many spoke of gratitude, some spoke of guilt. Survivor Li Min confessed that she had never fully understood why Rabe stayed. He could have gone, she said. We wouldn't have blamed him. But he didn't. He watched us suffer. And he suffered too. And sometimes I think maybe we gave him too much pain. Maybe we asked too much of him. But Rabe never asked to be thanked. In his diaries, he rarely mentioned personal sacrifice. He spoke instead of frustration that he could not do more, that he could not stop the soldiers at every gate, that he could not protect every girl dragged away in the night. His guilt was a quiet thread woven through every page, every paragraph. The survivors understood that too. Many of them, even in their final years, would light incense for him. They placed small offerings near his portrait. Some called him the second Buddha. Others simply called him Old Mr. Rabe. In a culture that reveres ancestors and remembers the dead with care, Rabe was not a foreigner. He was part of the family. Their stories, though emotional, were not only about Rabe. They also spoke about the others, the missionaries, the nurses, the unsung heroes who made up the web of protection in the safety zone. But Rabe was the centerpiece, the man whose political affiliation should have made him the villain, but whose actions made him unforgettable. As these survivors passed on, their families carried their memories. In modern-day Nanjing, some children bear the name Rabe as a middle name. Others visit the museum that was once his home and weep at the photographs. Their stories are part of the curriculum now, woven into the moral fabric of a city still healing. But more than that, their testimonies give weight to history. They remind us that statistics, 200,000 sheltered, tens of thousands saved, are not just numbers. They are lives, names, laughs never lost, hands once held. And behind many of them stood John Rabe, frail, tired, compromised, but unshakable. The war didn't end for John Rabe when he left Nanjing. It followed him, silently, persistently, etched into his memory like scars that never fully faded. In Berlin, surrounded by rubble and silence, his past lived louder than the world around him. The diary that had once been a tool of accountability became something else entirely in his later years, a lifeline, a confession booth, and in many ways, his last attempt to make sense of what he had witnessed. He wrote less frequently as the years passed, but when he did, the words came heavy, often in fragments. Not the clinical reports of a committee chairman, but the musings of a man trying to carry the weight of 10,000 ghosts in a city that barely remembered his name. He wrote about the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the faces of raped girls and mutilated bodies would reassemble in his dreams, forcing him back into the garden on Guanghua Road, back into the stench of smoke and blood. I did not go to China to be anyone's savior, one entry reads. And yet, they call me that. They call me Buddha. I do not deserve the name. A Buddha would not have failed so many. I failed more than I saved. He obsessed over the failures, not the victories. Every girl he couldn't save. Every soldier he couldn't stop. Every time he heard screaming and couldn't intervene. He remembered the moment he stood outside the German embassy, begging for more diplomatic pressure, and being told to stay silent. The letter he wrote to Hitler, never answered. The files he sent to the German press, never published. The swastika I wore bought me time, he wrote. But time was not enough. Every piece of paper I sent was a brick thrown into the ocean. No one wanted to know. He didn't absolve himself. That was never his aim. His reflections often circled back to his early support for the Nazi regime, a decision he had made, he claimed, out of economic desperation and patriotic naivety. But the more he learned about what his own government was doing, especially as rumors of death camps began surfacing, the more disgusted he became. "I see the newspapers now," he wrote in 1943, "and I wonder if I ever really understood what I was part of. In Nanjing, I saw what unchecked hatred looks like. I see now that our government is no better. The machine grinds on different flags, same hunger for death." He didn't speak these things aloud, not in public. To do so would have meant arrest. But the guilt seeped through every page. Not guilt for being German, or even for being a party member, but for not doing more, for not seeing sooner, for thinking he could compartmentalize his ethics from his affiliations. What haunted Rabe the most wasn't just the violence, but the silence of the world, the refusal of his own government to even acknowledge what happened in Nanjing, the indifference of his fellow countrymen when he returned. Even Siemens, who had once valued him, quietly moved on, treating him like an uncomfortable memory they didn't want to claim. His finances collapsed. His home was bombed. He lived in the ruins with his wife and children, surviving on rations, begging former colleagues for assistance. Every now and then, a letter would arrive from China, a survivor writing to say thank you, a student sharing that Rabe's name was being taught in classrooms. These were the few bright moments that broke through the fog of bitterness and despair. "They remember me in Nanjing," he wrote in 1947. "But here, I am no one. A man who once waved a flag and shouted in the street. A man with no power now, no voice." And yet he kept writing. He believed deeply that memory mattered, that if the world would not act, it must at least remember. He wrote not just for historians, but for his grandchildren, for future generations who might ask, "What did you do when the world burned?" In one of his last known entries, penned with a shaky hand months before his death, he wrote, "I am not a hero. I am only a witness. And if being a witness means you carry the pain with you until the end, then so be it. I would rather remember than pretend none of it happened." He died in 1950, not with fanfare, but with quiet. His passing made no headlines in Germany. There were no state honors, no national reflection, just a modest funeral attended by a few family members and neighbors. His grave was simple. There was no marker at first, just a patch of earth, slowly being overtaken by weeds. But he had already written his epitaph. In diaries, in letters, in film, in the cries of the children he sheltered and the silence of those he mourned. His grave may have been forgotten, but his memory lived in Nanjing, in every student who walked to the museum once called his home, in every refugee whose grandchildren were alive because one man decided not to look away. History doesn't hand out halos. It rarely tells clean stories, and almost never offers perfect heroes. But sometimes it shows us something more valuable than perfection. It shows us complexity. And in that complexity, we find truths far more powerful than simplicity ever allows. John Rabe's story is one of those rare legacies, a mirror held up to our assumptions about morality, identity, and the quiet power of doing the right thing when the world seems to be losing its mind. Decades after his death, Rabe's name finally began to echo beyond the walls of Nanjing. Historians published essays. Filmmakers told his story. Students in China and Germany studied his diaries. His name began to appear in exhibitions on humanitarianism, in courses on ethics, in discussions about what it means to act with courage inside compromised systems. And yet, his legacy remains strangely out of place, too uncomfortable to be widely celebrated in the West, too contradictory to be easily packaged in mainstream narratives. But perhaps that's exactly why it matters. Because Rabe's life, when examined honestly, does something very few stories do. It refuses to let us sit comfortably. It makes us ask hard questions. It forces us to look at the idea that goodness can live inside someone who were a symbol of evil, that someone deeply flawed, even complicit in a broader system of oppression, can still make choices that save lives. And it asks us, if we had been in his position, what would we have done? Would we have stayed? The deeper truth of John Rabe's legacy is that it shatters binary thinking. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a savior. He was a man shaped by his time, by politics, by bureaucracy, by his own ambitions. And yet, in the crucible of horror, he made a choice most would not. He saw suffering, and instead of turning away, he walked toward it, not to fight, not to dominate, but simply to protect. In doing so, he proved that heroism is not the property of the virtuous or the powerful. It is the property of the present, the moment, the decision. The people of Nanjing understood this long before the rest of the world did. For them, Rabe wasn't just a figure from the past. He was a thread in the fabric of their survival. His story wasn't just history, it was family history. Personal, generational. To them, the man in the garden with the swastika armband wasn't a contradiction. He was the reason they existed. And in honoring him, they didn't erase the complexity. They embraced it. In the John Rabe Memorial Hall, there's a glass case containing one of the flags he flew over his house, the red, white, and black of the Third Reich. But it isn't displayed with reverence. It's displayed with irony, with gravity, with the recognition that history is often built from contradictions, and that symbols can be repurposed by those with the courage to challenge what they stand for. The house itself is quiet. No grand exhibits. No propaganda. Just rooms filled with documents, photographs, and letters, each one telling a piece of a story that still feels fragile, like it could slip away if we stopped paying attention. Outside, in the garden where hundreds once slept under the open sky, there's a plaque with a simple inscription. Here, between war and mercy, stood a man who did not look away. That's the heart of his legacy. Not that he was perfect, but that he looked, that he stayed, that when the city was drowning in fire and blood, he did not climb aboard the last ship out. He rolled up his sleeves, picked up a pen, and started documenting the apocalypse, not for glory, not even for history, but because the people suffering in front of him deserved to be seen, deserved to be remembered. And that's where his story comes to meet us, now in the present. We live in a world where atrocities still happen, where civilians are still caught between armies, where nations still argue over history, where silence still wins far too often. And in that world, John Rabe becomes not just a historical figure, but a challenge, a whisper from the past asking us, what do we do when we see injustice? What do we do when we're handed power, no matter how small, to shield someone else from harm? Because that's the uncomfortable truth his life reveals. Most of us will never be forced into moral choices at gunpoint, but we will all, at some point, be faced with the choice to look or to look away. And when that moment comes, it won't be easy. It won't be convenient. It won't fit our politics or our comfort. It may come wrapped in contradiction. It may demand we act while carrying the weight of our own failures. But it will come, and when it does, Rabe's story reminds us what it looks like to choose conscience over comfort, to witness, to protect, to remember. John Rabe died poor, silenced, and largely forgotten by the country he served. But in the city he tried to save, his name still lives, not on the lips of politicians, but in the memories of families, in the silence of school children standing before his portrait, in the stories passed down in hushed voices, long after bedtime. And in that remembrance, there's a quiet victory, because a man who tried to stop a massacre with nothing but a flag, a diary, and his own stubborn decency did not disappear. He endured. He endures still,